we are going to discuss Johnson and Reconstruction. We're going to discuss Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction. Good thick notes. Let's go. Good thick notes. Complete notes. Lincoln's death creates an enormous outpouring of sympathy, both for the nation and for his successor. Lincoln's death creates this enormous outpouring of sympathy for his successor, as one would expect. As one would expect. The vice president does not expect to be president, and so for the vice president to wind up as president, it's sort of like getting a job that you don't really want. You hope that you don't get that job, and all of a sudden you got the job. I don't want to repeat what the text and what the stamp book say, but just for convenience, don't write this down. Let me just move through a couple of observations about Johnson. Are you listening? Don't write this down. Johnson, as you know, was not a Republican. He was a Democrat. He was a senator from the state of Tennessee. Tennessee was a border state that did not, that the Union tried to keep as a border state during the war. And Lincoln wanted Johnson on the ticket because Lincoln, as you know, felt very guilty about the Civil War and thought that it shouldn't be a Lincoln deal, it shouldn't be a Republican Party problem, it ought to be a problem about the Union. So he wanted Johnson to join him as a Unionist on the Union ticket. And they were successful. They got, and they got elected. Johnson also was very much a slaveholder. He believed in slavery, but he very much believed in the Union. And that's why he could accept being on the ticket. He didn't believe that slavery itself should be a defining issue in deciding whether one was interested in the Union or not interested. Okay? I suppose we could say this also about Johnson. Johnson was no Lincoln, meaning that he didn't have Lincoln's intellect. He didn't have Lincoln's compassion. He wasn't as humble as Lincoln. Johnson, how did Johnson begin his life? Does anybody know? Where did Johnson earn his, where did Johnson begin, so to speak? Somebody, go ahead, pal. He was a tailor. Oh my God. What would your mother say if you came home, Ma, I'm going to marry a tailor? She'd run under the bed, wouldn't she? Because in Europe, as in America at this time, if you married a tailor, you were marrying a person with zero social status. Not only did that person have zero social status, that person could have no social status. Get the idea? A tailor was the bottom of the barrel, to say the least. But this Johnson, are you listening? This Johnson was a very ambitious tailor. And he, with his wife's assistance, was able to build up a business, make money, enter politics, buy a plantation, own slaves. He's the epitome of upward economic mobility. He went from a tailor to being a patriarch of the Union, being a father figure in regards to the Union. He also tended to drink a bit. And he also tended to have a very vile tongue. And as I say, he didn't have Lincoln's compassion. I think I need to say one more thing about Johnson before we get into our concern with him. Johnson was a person who looked at life backwards, meaning that he did not look to the future in making assessments as to who he was or what the nation was. He looked backwards in order to find his own identity. Will you think about that? He thought of his identity as connected to the past. Therefore, who was his hero? Help me. Go ahead.
The aristocracy of the South?
Not exactly. More on that in a minute. Who does Johnson look to as a hero? Kind of pivotal. You didn't bump into this? You did bump into it somewhere. Go ahead.
Jefferson Davis?
No. His hero was Andrew Jackson. Write this down. Johnson's hero is Andrew Jackson. This is worthy of getting down. Johnson's hero is Andrew Jackson. Jackson, also a person who would have upward economic mobility, who began with nothing and who would make it to the White House. Johnson, who believed that this was a poor white man's country. Write that down. Jackson, who sees America as a poor white man's country, who accepts slavery. He accepts slavery, and he sees no contradiction. Jackson sees no contradiction between believing in slavery and believing in the Union. That's not a contradiction. That is not necessarily divisive. It became divisive, but not to Jackson and not to Johnson. So that when the war was over, Johnson accepts the idea that slavery is dead. He accepts the 13th Amendment. Write that down. Johnson will accept the 13th Amendment. He'll accept the end of slavery. He accepts the 13th Amendment. He accepts the end of slavery. But he does not accept the idea. Listen to this. But he does not accept the idea that the role of black people should be anything other than being agricultural laborers. He accepts the end of slavery. He accepts the end of slavery. But did you get that? But he believes that the role of the 4.5 million African American slaves who are now free, what is their role? Their role would be to continue to be the agricultural, no more slaves, but agricultural laborers of the South. Get the idea? Question. An articulate question, please. A question. You look puzzled. You shouldn't be puzzled. There's no need to be puzzled. He simply believes that now that the African American is free, what would be the natural role for the African American but to remain as the agricultural workforce that the work that they did in slavery, they now would continue now that they were free. He sees no problem with it. Hold on for a second. Hint. Johnson is looking backwards, isn't he? He's not talking about the future of black people. He's thinking of black people in a very staid way. He's thinking of black people in regards to how black people have lived their life. But he certainly is not bringing any new thought in regards to what the lives of black people are going to be like. By the way, are you listening? We could also say he feels the same in regards to poor white people in the South. He looks at life in a very static way. Now that the war is over, let's kiss, let's make up, let's live Lincoln's dream. Let's unify the country. That he wants to do. Let's unify the country. But let's not change anything. And let's certainly, are you listening? Let's certainly not think that we need, he wouldn't call it this, but what would be called anything approaching like a social revolution. Because a social revolution changes lots of stuff. Okay? He's looking backwards. You had a question. Come on.
Yes, is Johnson's theory, or is his idea, is it purely prejudicial, or does it have something to do with, without the black labor force, that the economy will suffer?
He's asking a good question. He's asking a good question. He wants to know what the motivation, what was Johnson's motivation, let us say, in regards to his observations of black people. What's his motivation? Johnson owned a plantation. Johnson understood the agricultural nature of the South. That was not going to change. That needed to be continued. The damage of the war needed to be done. The cities needed to be rebuilt. Plantations needed to be recreated, if you will. Business needed to continue. Blacks were going to do that work. Is he prejudicial toward blacks? Yes, he is. Is he racist? Yes, clearly he is. Yes, he is all of those things. But in his defense, if he walked down today, what would he say? He would say, I am no different than Lincoln. I want to do what Lincoln wanted to do. Put the Union back together. Let's put the Union back together. That is job one. That's what we need to do. That's my role, he would say. And what about concern for black people? He would say, I have no concern for black people, any more than Lincoln did. What did Lincoln say about concern for black people? That was not his department. He wouldn't say that, would he? Johnson would say the same thing. I have no comment in regards to black people. That's not a federal issue. That's an issue having to do with where black people live. Let the states determine that. But that's not my issue. And that tells us something, doesn't it? That helps us understand something. Are you listening? That helps us understand something about Johnson. Johnson doesn't appreciate when the fox is guarding the chicken coop. The fox guarding the chicken coop. So that black people were going to be dependent upon southern states? That's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Write this down. The Republican Party that controlled the Congress because the Democrats were out, because the Democrats had left the Union, the Republican Party controlled the Congress. And the love affair between the Republican Party and Johnson rapidly comes to an end. There is a love affair, okay? It's a brief love affair, okay? There's a brief love affair between Johnson and the Republicans. There's a brief feeling that the Republicans and Johnson have something in common. There's a very brief relationship, so to speak. Now I need you. Now I need you. Why do the Republicans come to the realization that Johnson may not exactly be the person that they hoped him to be? Are you thinking? Why do the Republicans suddenly come to the realization that maybe Johnson isn't their person? Hold on a second. The answer to all of this, by the way, where we're going, is not only about Johnson and not only about the Republicans, it's about the dilemma of race relations in America. Because that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about the dilemmas associated with race relations. Not the solutions, because there are no solutions. There are only dilemmas at this point. Get the idea? And so if I ask the question, what's the breakup between Johnson and the Republicans, what I'm really asking is, what are the dilemmas out there? What are the dilemmas? The dilemma is that Johnson does not want to deal with. Do you follow me? Do you understand where we're going? The dilemmas that Johnson doesn't want to deal with. Help me, start me off. Go ahead. Number one, what's the problem between the two, between the Republicans and Johnson? Did I make you forget?
Yes,
I made you forget. Go ahead. Now, I want you to, don't just read. I want you to talk from your heart. Come on.
Isn't it the civil rights bill that...
That's one problem. Okay, stop there. Stop there. Write this down. In 1866, the Congress passes a Civil Rights Act. In 1866, the Congress passes a Civil Rights Act. This Civil Rights Act, this act, don't write, listen, in 1866, this Civil Rights Act is merely the federal government passing a law that in effect says black people ought to be able to take a train, go to a hotel, sit in a restaurant, travel, take a walk without being harassed or murdered, without being intimidated. You get the idea? What is a Civil Rights Act? A Civil Rights Act is merely a statement having to do with how people go about their business. And why was it necessary to create a Civil Rights Act in 1866? You know why. Because 4.5 million blacks moved out of slavery into something called freedom, whatever that was. But how good would that freedom be if every step was a step that was full of not only incrimination, but potential destruction? Every step that you took, that when somebody looked at you, they didn't see a man, they didn't see a person, they saw race. A race in their eyes that was of a secondary status in society. Do you get the idea? So the Congress says we need to pass this Civil Rights Act. Okay? Continue with this idea for a minute. Continue with this idea. Very important idea. Listen to this. Don't fog out. Listen to this. From the war's end, from 1865 to 1866, the war was over. The war had come to an end. But something did not come to an end. The violence against black people. I could use a word. An insurgency existed. Write that down. An insurgency. An insurgency of white people who lost the war on the battlefield, but who never lost their hatred. They lost the war on the battlefield, but they had never abandoned their hatred. Do you see the problem? Not only did they never abandon their hatred, they became more hateful. Not only did they become more hateful, but they became organized. They operated at night. They operated in a way to harass and to murder black people. Do you get the idea? The war was over. The war was over, but the insurgency had just begun. Can you see the dilemma? Are you breathing? Can you see the dilemma that there is here? There's a further dilemma. Hold on. There's a further dilemma, because I want you to understand this in all of its depth. A further dilemma. Listen to this. The war was over. The insurgency was rampant. Even more dangerous, the signs, the code from wealthy whites, from Southerners, from Southern state governments, from aristocratic whites. The code coming from the upper echelons of society was that this was acceptable, that the violence was acceptable, that the violence was, in a sense, sponsored violence. Write that down. The violence is sponsored. The violence is sponsored, supported, sustained. The violence is supported. It is sustained. It is acceptable. With a wink. Overtly. Either overtly or with a wink. Do you see the horror of that? So that, in effect, get good thick notes, stop playing with your hands. So that, in effect, black people were hostage not to slavery, but to something as dangerous. Can you see that? The war was over. The 13th Amendment had been passed. The 13th Amendment had been ratified. But the lives of black people, were under this Ku Klux Klan empire. That's why it's often referred to as the empire of the Ku Klux Klan. Because it is an empire not only in space, God bless you, not only in space, in the southern states, but it's an empire in time. Did you get that? It's an empire in time, meaning it would be forever. They won. So what? They won. It's still our empire. And so what's the position of blacks in this empire? See how diminished blacks would be? So the Congress says we need a Civil Rights Act. We need a Civil Rights Act. And so the Congress creates a Civil Rights Act that is supposed to make this better. How can one government act make that better? It's not possible, is it? You see, it's impossible. In other words, the empire of the Ku Klux Klan was, in a sense, competing against the idea of a Civil Rights Act. Who's going to win that fight? Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act. The Republicans, in effect, write that down. Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Act, and the Congress overrides his veto. The Congress overrides his veto, but the Congress comes to the realization that Johnson is not one of them. Hold on, we're not ready for anything else yet, okay? You see that? You get that? All that I said is that Congress overrides the president's veto regarding this Civil Rights Act, regarding the Civil Rights Act. Questions? Come on, now I'm ready. Questions?
Not a question, but
Go ahead.
didn't they try to extend the freemen's?
That's another issue. Hold off on that. We're not there yet. We're not on that issue. Back to the Civil Rights Act. Back to this Civil Rights Act. Go ahead, my friend. Nice and loud.
I don't understand, like Johnson, he didn't like rich slave owners, like, so why would he in turn, like, try to...
Well, listen. He's asking a good question. He's asking a question that in effect says, he's asking a question similar to the question that the gentleman asked in regards to what was Johnson's motivation here. We said that Johnson certainly was indifferent to the plight of black people. We agree with that. He's not interested in the plight of black people. And so why is he hostile to this Civil Rights Act? Well, we could answer that in several ways. Never one way, always several. We could say, are you listening? We could say, point A, we could say this. We could say that don't write. Johnson simply did not believe that the federal government could or should be responsible for black people in the country. Who should be responsible for black people? Help me. Go ahead. Only the states. Your citizenship was predicated upon your state government. The state should be responsible. The fox guarding the chicken coop for black people. But Johnson did not believe that the federal government could do that, should do that. That was, Lincoln would not, Lincoln didn't say that either. Johnson would say, Lincoln wasn't in favor of that, I'm not in favor of that. The federal government can't do that. We fought this war. We lost 600,000 dead. We spent $15 billion. That's when $1 billion was a lot of dough. We spent $15 billion. And now we're going to protect some people? We can't protect anybody. That's one reason. Why else is Johnson critical of this Civil Rights Act?
He don't like blacks, period.
Well, Johnson, we said that Johnson was indifferent to the plight of blacks. But that doesn't tell us enough. That doesn't tell us enough. After all, how well liked, God bless you, how well liked were blacks in general? It's a problem, isn't it? Something else, come on. He said, we have to get back to the gentleman's point, because he introduced another element when he talked about rich white people, aristocratic people. Go ahead.
The more rights that blacks got, the more chances were that they would take the jobs and the livelihood.
But that's not true. That's not true, because Johnson says, look, there are 4.5 million blacks. Are you listening? They're the agricultural laborers. If they don't pick the cotton, who's going to pick the cotton? If they don't work with the tobacco, who's going to work with it? If they don't plant the rice, who's going to plant the rice? If they don't work with the cattle, if they don't work with the cows, if they're not doing the farm work, who's going to do it? It's their job. He sees that as their job. He simply wants them to go from being slaves to being sharecroppers. More on that in a minute. But the gentleman is saying something very interesting. He says, what's motivating Johnson? Yes, he's hostile to black people. Yes, he's backward looking. He's like Jackson. Yes, he believes that the role of the black should not change. All of that's true. Yes, he believes the federal government should have a limited role. That's true. He doesn't want the federal government to have a big role. But there's something else about Johnson. Do the Democrats like him? Do other Democrats like Johnson? They think he's a piece of caca. They say, you're a traitor. We were Democrats. We left the Union. You're a Democrat who stayed in the Union. You're a piece of caca. And what about the Republicans? The Republicans say, Johnson, you're a Democrat. You're a piece of caca. The Republicans hate him. The Democrats hate him. But he's a politician. Have you noticed something about politicians? Do they have ambition? Can you be a politician without ambition? You can't. The DNA of a politician is to have ambition. He has ambition. He says, everybody's against me. Everybody's against me. Watch me survive. Questions? More. Go ahead.
If they all disliked him, why didn't, when they tried to impeach him, why wasn't he impeached?
You know, because he was saved from impeachment. He was impeached, but he was not convicted. Because what he did wasn't probably worthy of being convicted. They didn't, listen, stop yawning. The Republicans recognized that Johnson was not an ally of theirs. Johnson had other ambitions. Johnson had an ambition to, in a sense, create his own, write this down. Johnson had an ambition to create his own political network, maybe his own political party. Johnson thought that he could put his own party together. So he thought. He thought that he could put the Lincoln people together with the people who were unionist, with the people who were even anti-black. He thought he could create his own political party, built around himself. After all, he was the follower of Lincoln. He saved the Union. He was anti-black. He wanted to keep the society harmonious. He thought that he could keep it all together. He deluded himself. By the way, do politicians frequently delude themselves? They do, don't they? That's when they often seem ridiculous. Have you noticed how many politicians seem ridiculous? You say, that's ridiculous. Well, they've deluded themselves. Don't make me make examples here, okay? There are too many to go to. I don't want to do that, all right? But so he's a little ridiculous in that regard. So to get to this point, so he vetoes the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the Congress overrides his veto. Stop the music. What about the empire? What about the Ku Klux Klan, the empire of the Ku Klux Klan? What about the harassment on blacks? What about the murder? What about the intimidation? All of that only continues. That gets worse. Johnson's oblivious to that getting worse and worse. Question.
Is he purposely oblivious to that?
He doesn't believe that that's his responsibility. That's not the job of the president. That's the job of other branches of government, of other levels of government. I have to ask a question. While conditions are getting worse for black people, what is providing some salvation for blacks? What's providing some salvation? 1, 2.
Education.
Not exactly. Hold off. Go ahead. Not exactly. Something. Go ahead. Well, you're saying, listen, I asked the wrong question. I asked an imprecise question. You're right that the Freeman's Bureau was providing some help. The church was useful. Blacks were trying to educate themselves. All of that's true. And the Hortons tell us that, don't they? The Hortons explain that. But what the Hortons don't explain particularly well, that needs to be explained better, very little of that would have happened to the extent that it did were it not for, help me, with the hands, were it not for 150,000 federal troops most of whom were black, who continued to reside in the South. 150,000 federal troops remained in the South so that blacks could exercise some discretion in their life in daylight. But what happens when nighttime came? Now the empire of the Ku Klux Klan would emerge. 150,000 federal troops kept order. Did 150,000 federal troops change any of the dynamics here? Did it diminish the hatred? Did it change the Ku Klux Klan? Did it change race relations? Did it do anything other than keep a lid on it? Do you see the problem? That's what those troops were doing. Professor, get me back to Johnson. Get me back to Johnson. Johnson is watching it all go by. Is this a dilemma? This is a dilemma, isn't it? And so this Civil Rights Act of 1866 that promised blacks an opportunity to go about their business in freedom was empty. Who's paying? I have to ask myself another question. Are you listening? Who's paying attention to all this? With the hands. Who's paying attention? Go ahead. Pardon me? The Republicans. There is a group of, write this down. There certainly is a group of Republicans in the Congress. There's a group of Republicans in the Congress who are paying attention. There's a group within the Congress who are Republicans who are paying attention. Not the entire Republican Party, but a group within the Congress who are very pro-black, who will be called radicals. They are paying attention, and they see the discrepancy. They see that Johnson is really not doing what Johnson should be doing. And as the young lady points out, they, in a sense, go out of their way to try to get Johnson out of the presidency. They try to set Johnson up for impeachment. They do set him up for impeachment. He is impeached, but he is not convicted. But he is made to be a non-entity. He's no longer, during this impeachment process, he will not be a significant political player. He wasn't a significant political player. And the impeachment and the trial just confirmed that. Are you listening? But what's the dilemma? Ladies and gentlemen, please don't forget the dilemma. The dilemma is you've got 4.5 million people who are living in a limbo. They are not really free. They're not really free. And there is no way for them, there's no way for them to exercise a greater freedom. Didn't Lincoln tell us this would happen? This is what Lincoln told us. So the Congress tries another idea. The Congress passes what was called a Freedmen's Bureau. Continue. The Congress also passes a Freedmen's Bureau, which was an attempt to provide some education, some medical assistance, and an attempt to provide a bridge to the blacks who were slaves and to a new reality. Yeah.
When it comes to the Republican Republicans in Congress.
Yes.
Most of them radicals or most of them moderates, or is it kind of?
No, I think it's fair to say this, and here is where Stamp is very good. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 in Stamp. Do you follow me? Stamp tries to explain. By the way, I know I don't think Stamp's such a great writer, but Stamp is saying some very interesting things. Stamp is saying that the radicals were really a small group within the Republican Party, but they had an idea, they had a plan. There was a moderate group of Republicans and there were conservative Republicans. The radicals make up probably the smallest group, but listen to this. The outrages taking place against black people are becoming prominently, let us say, announced in newspapers. Stories are being written in the New York press, in the Boston press. Are you listening? Regarding the problems of black people. These problems are gaining public attention and notoriety. That notoriety was empowering the radicals. Johnson also was indirectly empowering the radicals. And so as a result, the radicals are being energized by the Ku Klux Klan and the atrocities against black people. And it seems as though nothing was providing any relief. I suppose I could say this. Are you listening? I could say this. Because whenever we talk about motivation, we talk about something very complex, okay? Many white people wanted to kick the South in the rear end. Many white people said, why did we fight this war? Why did we lose 600,000 dead? So that everything could go back to the way it was? That isn't why we fought that war. So the motivation of the radicals, the motivation of Republicans, is not only in regards to dealing with the plight of black people, but dealing with what we would call vengeance. There is an element of vengeance here. 1, 2. Are you listening? I'm waiting. Hold on, I'll get back to you. Put that away. Go ahead, pal.
Wasn't Johnson at first perceived as a radical by congressmen?
We said that, yes. We said that he was positively received. Yes. You had your hand up before. You forgot.
Now you already said.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
The vengeance you're talking about, is this what we're talking about with Reconstruction?
The vengeance, listen, ladies and gentlemen, the vengeance has to do with the point I made the other day about the cost of this war, what this war did. This war created an incredible pain in society. When the war is over, don't you think people want there to be something definite that occurred? Don't people want to say, isn't it only natural for people to say, was it worth it? When this war was over, white people said, was it worth it? Well, how can it be worth it? Look at, black people are still being terrorized. They're not slaves, but they're terrorized. Southern aristocrats who started the war are gaining their popularity and taking control of state governments. Was it worth it? That's the kind of vengeance I'm talking about. More from you. Go ahead.
I thought that was like one of the reasons that the Republicans really didn't like Johnson, because he was so lenient on the South. Yes. Johnson did not identify with what we would call a progressive legacy. He didn't, as I said, he didn't want to see change take place. He looked backwards. He didn't want there to be a change. He wanted it all to revert to the way it was. Okay? Are you there? Are you breathing? Questions? Questions? All that I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, this is why you're reading, okay? All that I'm saying is that we don't have to get hung up on Johnson to understand the dilemma. The dilemma was, how were these black people going to live their life within the empire of the Ku Klux Klan? Within the empire of hatred. That's the dilemma. How is that dilemma going to be resolved? How is that dilemma going to be resolved? Not with Johnson, right? We can kiss off on Johnson. It's not about Johnson. We know Johnson. We know what Johnson's up to. How's the dilemma going to be resolved? Go ahead.
Isn't that why most blacks started going military?
That they joined the military?
They started going military.
Well, blacks sought to protect themselves. Blacks joined the Union Army. Blacks tried to provide some protection for their loved ones. Blacks tried to create some institutions that would give them some support. All within the context of this darkness. Don't forget, in the daytime, there'd be the Union Army, but in the nighttime, there was the night riders of the Ku Klux Klan who came to your house, who knocked the door down, who murdered your husband, and who left you with the message that some other night they'll return for you. Have a nice day. Do you see the dilemma? And my question is, how is this going to change? How is this going to change? Could it change? That's why it's a dilemma. Could this change? Even without getting into any of the specifics, you might say, this can never change because it's all based on something. It's based on the hatred that white people felt for black people. How many of you see it that way? There's a lot of truth to that. This could not change because regardless of who the president is, regardless of the Congress, there's a hatred there, isn't there? There's a hatred of white people regarding black people. Just as Lincoln said. Lincoln said he could not see black people and white people living harmoniously together on the basis of equality. Are you listening? He could not see that happening. He couldn't see it. He couldn't envision it. He died, and the lack of envisioning it continued. Do you see why stop tapping? Do you see why Johnson is less than critical? Johnson's a symptom. He's a symptom of the problem. It's true. He's a symptom, but he's not critical. What was more critical? The hearts of people. Can you see that? Johnson's a symptom of everything that's wrong. More from you. I know you're tired. You're tired. Who cares? Okay? Terrific. You're tired. Welcome to America. Everybody's tired in America. That's why people come here to sleep, you know? You're tired. Terrific. We could say this. I want to say this one thing, one point. Johnson said something that was interesting and outrageous. That's worth explaining. Johnson said, you Republicans don't write. You Republicans, you are no good. You don't care about black people. You don't care about black people any more than I care about black people, Johnson would say. You Republicans, you merely want their votes. You want the 700,000 votes. There were 700,000 eligible voters. You want those 700,000 votes. That's why you Republicans say that you care about black people. But you don't really care about them as people any more than I do. You merely want their vote. And you want their vote, you Republicans. Listen to this. You want their vote, you Republicans, because your party is a party that is connected to the railroads, Wall Street, big business, money, the East, everything that I hate. Write that down. Johnson makes these points. Johnson says the Republicans don't care about black people. Republicans don't care about black people. Republicans don't care about black people. And he makes a further point that the Republicans are a party connected to the East, wealth, and economic power. Okay? All that I said is that Johnson feels that the Republicans aren't to be, that the motivation of the Republicans is not pure. Stop the music. We have not resolved the dilemma, have we? What's the dilemma? The dilemma is we've got 4.5 million citizens who are living in a condition of great intimidation. And who is helping, who is trying to solve the problem that they have regarding their intimidation? Not Johnson. Only the Republicans will step forward and say, I'm going to try to solve that problem. Get the idea? The Republicans try to step forward and say, I'm going to solve that problem. We might say, nobody's going to solve this problem. We might say that, right? But the Republicans thought that they could. Questions from you? Questions? Are you thinking? Question? Yes, sir. Nice and loud. Come on.
Isn't Johnson kind of right, though? Because there's a lot of white voters who couldn't vote because of the war.
Okay, wait a second. If the gentleman means, did Republicans want blacks to vote for them? Of course. Does that make Johnson right? No. More observations. Professor, I have a question. How come blacks couldn't protect themselves completely in this period of time? Go ahead.
Because the law enforcement, everyone, the
You listening?
majority in the South, they were all white. They all had the same.
It's not possible, because it's not possible. Because the super, it's sort of like, how come you don't protect yourself against the state police, Massachusetts State Police? Cop stops you on the highway, you say, I wasn't speeding, you're harassing me. I'm going to have my brothers come down and, it's convoluted, it's crazy, right? It doesn't work that way. What about the Horton essay? What about what the Horton said about how blacks tried to educate themselves, tried to church themselves, tried to protect themselves, tried to inspire one another? That all happened. That's all true. But it's a truth with another truth. And the other truth is that the Ku Klux Klan and the hatred of white people existed simultaneously. Because one truth does not negate another truth. More observations. More observations from you. Okay? I'm going to stop there. I know.